Okay, so you can see that I just have a basic folder layout where I have an index.html, and all it has is a very simple form and select field into the form, and it just includes jQuery and the inputs.js. Now inputs.js is currently empty, and that's what we're going to start working on right now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're just going to create our application. And this application, how we're going to initialize it is we're just going to type in var, and we can call it whatever we want, but I'm just going to be calling it custom input application, like so. And what it's going to be equal to is it's just going to be equal to a function. First we're going to open bracket, type function, open and close brackets, and I choose to drop down the curly braces because I believe it's easier to read. In some functions you don't drop down the curly brace, otherwise it won't work, but for the ones that you do, I believe it's easier to read this way. And now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make the dollar symbol equal to the jQuery. Now the reason why I'm passing jQuery in like this and not just using jQuery as the default dollar symbol anyway is because if we ever want to change from jQuery to another language, we just have to change this variable here from jQuery to the language name or library name even, and this here, this dollar symbol will be equal to that library, and that means that all of the code within this, we won't have to change the selector symbol or anything like that. We can just keep it the same. It's a lot more maintainable. Now what we want this application to do is run onload. So what I like to do is in the same document just have the onload function run the start method of this application. So how we're going to do that is we're just going to do document.ready, and I'm sure you know this function. It's probably one of the most well used jQuery function in the world, and it just basically means that when the document is ready, when it's loaded, we're going to run a function, and the function is whatever's inside these curly braces. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to call out the custom input application, and I'm just going to do .start. And now this start method hasn't been created yet, so don't worry if you're wondering where the hell this start method has came from, because it's not there, don't worry. Now the hierarchy and order of applications, I like to put the variables first, and then I like to go down to the functions, and then I like to go down to the return. And now the return is when you make the methods, and that's why this start method doesn't exist yet, because it's not in the return. So what we're going to do is we're just going to type return. Now this is one of the cases where we don't drop down a curly brace, so we just go like that and make sure we're closing it off with the semicolon. Now this is where we create our methods for the application, and that is like .start. So what you would do for .start is you would just do start, colon, and then the function you want to run. Now the start function, I always like to call it ignition because it's like starting the function up, like think of it like a car, and it's like starting the ignition. So I'm just going to say ignition here. Now you can add more methods, like for example if you wanted to make a .disable method, then you would just apply it to the function like disable input or something like that, and that would disable, or we would make it disable the custom inputs to make it go back to default if you ever wanted to do that. But for right now, we're just going to be working with this one function. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare and build the ignition function. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're just going to type in var ignition, and this is going to declare the ignition to equal to the function, and we're going to open and close brackets and drop down and open and close the curly braces. Now we always close the curly braces when we're declaring a function with a semicolon, otherwise it will make an error and won't run. Okay, so what ignition does is it basically just manages where our functions go and how they're sort of selected and activated. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to run the first function without doing a event handler. It's just going to run onload, and this function is going to basically be called build custom like display, maybe. You can call it whatever you want as long as it matches the function that we make. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to go up here just before ignition, and we're going to do exactly the same sort of layout. So we're going to do var build custom display equals function, like so. And what this is going to do is basically on ready, we're going to do the start. And the first thing the start does is run ignition. And the first thing ignition does is build the custom display. So in the build custom display function is where we want to, believe it or not, build the custom display. Now to build the custom display, I've said that function a lot, but anyway, to build the custom display, we're going to go into index, and you can either have it select every single select field on the page, or if you only want it to select certain ones, what's probably better is we just add a class. And I like to prefix my classes to anything that's using JavaScript. So anything that's is needed for JavaScript to work, I prefix JS to the class so that I know that if I'm ever going to change the style, don't delete that class because it doesn't actually affect the styling, just the JavaScript. So we're just going to do JavaScript apply maybe like custom select or something like that. It doesn't have to be as long, it could be whatever you want. But the whole point in this class here is that it doesn't affect the styling, and it just purely is a selector for JavaScript. Now in the variable section of our application, we're just going to make a var, and we're going to call it like select input selector, and it's going to be equal to dot for the class and JS apply custom select. Now how we target that selector as a jQuery element is within the build custom display function, and we're just going to write a var, and it's going to be equal to, we're going to just call the var, let's say input or select fields, like so, and it's going to be equal to the jQuery selector here, open and close brackets, and then within the brackets what we're going to do is we're just going to have the input selector, like so, and that's the variable which we created up here. Now the reason why we do it like this is because if we ever wanted to change the class of the selector to something a bit smaller, we could just get rid of that apply altogether and have JS custom select, and then all I'd have to do is change it up here, and it would apply across the whole of the application, and it would work a lot easier. Also notice that whenever we are creating a jQuery element, so whenever we're using jQuery to define the element, we're actually naming the variable with the prefix of the dollar symbol. That way if we're ever quickly browsing through our code, we know which is a jQuery element and which is, for example, a normal variable. Now we can kind of test it out by just making all of the select fields .hide. And now what that should do is if I open up Chrome, you can see that this is what the default display was, default option 1, 2, 3, 4. And if I refresh, you can see now that it's hidden because the JavaScript is running the file, selecting the input field, and then hiding it, just like we're telling it to do. Okay, so now that we've got that and we know it's working, we know that it's selecting all of the select fields on the page, what we want to do is we just want to have some validation, and how we're going to do that is we're just going to check if that select field exists on the page before doing anything, because otherwise if you include this page on, or if you include this application on every page, you can't rely on every page having a select field. So what we do for this is we can just do a simple if condition, and we can just do if select fields dot length is greater than 0. Now what that does is if there is basically more than one of these elements or more than 0 of these elements on the page, then we're going to run whatever in here. Alright, so in here what we're going to do is we're just going to do a for each for every select input. Now jQuery makes this really simple by just doing select fields dot each, and we can just run a function like so. Now that allows us to do, basically it says for every single one of these select fields I want to do this. So within here what we're going to do is we're just going to first create a variable, and the variable name is going to be called current select, and it's going to be equal to this, like so. And now this selector, that was a bit of a confusing sentence, basically on the each, basically for every single one that we're looping through, it targets the current select to equal the one that we're currently selected on. And now what we're going to do after that is think about it for a little bit. So what we want is we want to hide the current display, and then we want to show and build a div display. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do the current select hide first, like so. And now what we're going to do is we're just going to make some more variables. Now the first variable is going to select all of the options. So what we're going to do is we're going to do var select options, and it's going to be equal to current select dot find, and it's going to find all of the options within that. So what we're going to do is we're going to find the option tags within the current selected select field, and then that's going to be equal to a select options variable. Alright, so now what we're going to do is going to be making some more variables, and it's going to be building the markup for our display, custom display. So we're going to create a var, and I'm just going to say select markup for the main select field, like so, and it's going to be equal to a div element. And then below it I'm going to have exactly the same, but only this is going to be called the drop down list. So drop down list. Now this is going to be a UL element, and I'm going to style the UL to be cool and look nice. Now for these elements we actually have to wrap them in the brackets, because we're not actually selecting anything on the page but instead creating something. Sorry about that. Make sure we're closing everything off with a semicolon, and then we're going to create our last variable actually, and it's going to be called the current selected state, and that is also just going to be another div. The select markup is going to basically be selecting everything that will build the select field. The drop down list is going to be the drop down list display, and the current selected state is going to be, for example, like the little input which shows, and then you click it and it shows the drop down state. And then obviously whenever you click like an item in the drop down, then it's going to change the current selected state to that item and make the drop down go back up. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do another each method or another each function for each option that's in the select field. So what we're going to do is we're going to do select field options. So just select options, and then we're going to do dot each function, just like we did before. And now what this basically is saying is for each options within the currently selected select field, what we're going to do is within here, we're just going to create a new variable, and just like before, we're going to have this variable be the currently selected element throughout the each loop. So we're just going to call this element maybe select options, or maybe current option actually, and it's going to be equal to this, just like before. Now what we're going to do with this is we're going to just make it append some HTML. Okay, and then once we have this, what we're going to do is we're just going to append to the drop down list, which is the unordered list variable or element, and we're just going to append the list items. So what we're going to do is we're just going to do drop down list dot append, and we're just going to write in some HTML. So we're just going to open the li tag and we're going to close the li tag. Now within this we want to pass some dynamic content. So we're going to close off the strings and concatenate them onto each other using the pluses, and then within here what we're going to do is we're just going to create a jQuery element or jQuery selector, text, jQuery value, whatever you want to call it, and it's just going to be equal to the text of the option. So let's just go through the workings of this in our heads quickly. What it's doing is for each select field, it's then creating the elements that we need, and then for every single option within that select field, what it's going to do is it's going to, for example, take all of these, and then for every single one it's going to build out a list item, and it's going to take this text, which is what we're going to add in now. So we're just going to do the current option dot text in here. So it's going to take that text and it's going to put it in the list item, and it's going to append that list item into the unordered list, which will act as our drop down field later. Okay, so once we've done that, we're just going to build out the markup just a little bit more. And because we want to be styling this, we want each element to have a class which is easily styled. So if you notice about the hierarchy of the application which I'm making, all of the variables which can be changed quite easily. For example, if we ever want to change the name of the classes, go right at the top, so we only have to change it once, and then it changes throughout the whole document. So I'm just going to create a var, and I'm going to call it select class, and it's just going to be select. Or actually, I'm just going to call it select field, just to define it a bit more. And then I'm going to create another class variable, and it's going to be the current selected element class. That's quite a long name, but it doesn't matter. You can call it whatever you want, and it's just going to be have the class of current, and one last one for the drop down class, and I'm just going to have that the class of drop down. Okay, so this means that basically what we're going to do is we're going to add the classes to the select markup drop down list and current selected state, so that when we come across to styling it, probably in part 3, it'll be really easy because we just have classes to target. Alright, so how we're going to add these classes is for each one. So for example, the select markup, we're just going to do dot add class and then the class which you wanted to add to it, so select class. And then we're going to do the same for the other two. So the current selected state is going to have the .add class method in jQuery, and it's just going to be the current selected element class. And then the drop down list is going to have the add class of drop down class, like so. So that takes these markup elements and add some classes so that we can go ahead and style the classes, and it'll be really easy to style. So now what we're going to do is we're just going to sort of pass some dynamic content into the markup, and that content is basically we want a default current selected state, because anytime you go on a site and you see the input field, it always has like a default state, which normally, in fact every field that I've seen, is the first option, because the value is normally equal to nothing, and then it's always like select from the list below or select your age. And then with the PHP or anything that you're using to pass your data, you can just be like, if the value is equal to nothing, then they obviously haven't selected an option. So what we're going to do for that is we're just going to do the current selected state dot text, and that's going to equal the select options dot first, so we're selecting the first option, and then dot text. So you see how the select option variable here selects all of the options within the current selected select field. What we're going to do is we're just going to run through all of them select options, select the first one, and collect the text. So it's selecting this option as the first one, and collecting the text and putting it into the default selected state. Okay, so now once we've done that, what we want to do is we kind of just want to build all of this together. So what we're going to do is, as everything's going within the main select markup class or container element, we're just going to have the select markup dot append, and we're first going to append the current selected state. Make sure you're putting the dollar symbol in front of that, so because it's the element here. And then also we're going to append the drop down list. So it's first going to append the currently selected state within that, and then it's going to append the drop down list. Okay, so once we've done that, now we need to actually insert this element onto the page. Now, if you can imagine in your head, once we're sort of changing the information with this to the default select field that's hidden, we kind of want it to select the right select field because you might have multiple ones in the same form. So how we're going to do that is using the jQuery.closest method. So we want to make sure that we insert this markup as close to the element that we want to change as possible. So what we're going to do is we're just going to take the select markup which we just made, and we're just going to do the insert before method in jQuery. Now we're going to insert before the current select because the current select is basically what we defined up here, which is the current select field, which gets all of the information, and then once we populate the custom element that we made, we're going to just insert the HTML into the form, which will be just before the currently selected one. So if we save this out and we go to Google Chrome and we refresh, you can see that the input now hides and we get given the default option as the default current display, and you can see we have the UR or the UL even, the unordered list and list items of every option within that dropdown. Now in part 2, what I'm going to be going over is how to make sure that this default option doesn't show twice. So for example, anything that is in the current display is also hidden from the dropdown because there's no point in showing it twice. And we're going to make it so when you can click these, it changes this value here, and it's going to change it to whichever one you click. We're also going to go over how you can still pass the information to the select field. So when you're clicking these, it changes the select field in the background so that when you actually post your form, nothing will change in the backend wise. Okay, and then in part 3, I'll probably go over the styling if there's nothing else or nothing else that I've left out, and we'll style this to look like a nice drop-down input field like the illustration at the start of the introduction. Okay, so thanks for watching. This has been Creating a Custom Select Field Part 2.